Hello, everybody, and welcome back. I'm Ted. In our last lecture, we examined the career of Jesse Jackson. Remarkable career, remarkable man. In our last lecture, just to do a quick recap of everything, continuing in the footsteps of our time-honored recap. Jesse Jackson was an aide, a mentee of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He had marched. He had participated in the Selma March, and that has sparked an interest in community organization and fighting for civil rights in him. Yeah, it wasn't long after the march in Selma that he joined the SCLC, and he worked very closely with Martin Luther King Jr. He was appointed to oversee Operation Breadbasket in Chicago. In 1968, he traveled down to Memphis to support Dr. King as he led efforts by striking sanitation workers for better wages, hours, and employment opportunities. Unfortunately, because he had gone down there to help aid Dr. King, he was a witness to Dr. King's assassination. From there, he went on to organize Push, Operation Push, to further social change and to further promote socially progressive politics. During the 1980s, he founded the Rainbow Coalition, which brought in a greater number of people. It allowed him to, one, preserve his aspiring political ambitions while also furthering his policy and his aspiration for socially progressive politics in the United States. Also, during the 80s, he made two failed bids to secure the Democratic Party presidential nomination. In 1984, he surprised many observers with his ability to bring in 3.5 million votes, and also to lead voter registration drives that brought in close to 1 million new voters. In 1988, Jackson doubled those numbers. He finished first runner-up, losing out to Governor Michael Dukakis of Massachusetts. But Jackson was able to win to garner 7 million votes, doubling his number in 1984, and he was able to secure the registration of 2 million new voters. So not winning the nominations, but proven to be a force in and of himself within progressive politics and within the Democratic Party. And from there, we pick back up with our story on covering Jesse Jackson. And from there, we move on and we look at 1990. In 1990, Jesse Jackson is elected as the shadow senator for the District of Columbia, the only elected office that he would ever hold, at least thus far to date, the only elected office that he would hold. Now, while serving as the shadow senator for the District of Columbia, Jackson helped to illustrate the needs of the community of Washington, D.C. in Congress. He later helps to negotiate the release of hostages, American hostages being held in Kuwait and Iraq. Now, in 1997, President Bill Clinton appoints Jesse Jackson as the United States Special Envoy to Africa. And domestically, on the domestic front, Jesse Jackson helps to propose new initiatives to help close the learning gap between the ethnicities in the republic, and he does so by garnering pledges from more than 40,000 parents who pledged to become more involved in their children's education. Now, in 1999, Jackson, again under the direction of President Bill Clinton, travels to Serbia to negotiate the release of American POWs who are captured along the Macedonian border. And of course, in 2000, Jackson leads protests in Palm Beach County, Florida, in response to allegations of improper conduct and voting irregularities during the presidential vote tally. From there, we sort of stop and we will take a pause and we'll examine another group and a group that had always been around, but a group that for the most part, was not really able to distinguish itself from the African American community as a whole. For those within all communities, you would find people along various spots in the political spectrum. You'll find liberals and conservatives and like centrists. But within the African American community, consistently from 1619 until the 1960s, 1970s, there had always been a sort of uniformity in that because the community had to deal with slavery and second-class citizenship, where slavery wasn't there, and then of course after slavery and Reconstruction, following on the heels of redemption, there was Jim Crow to contend with. With the abolishment of Jim Crow and with the actions and activities of all of these politicians and social organizers, a bit of normalcy sort of fell on the Republic, in which African Americans were able to improve their situation. They were able to enter into the larger political dilemma. They were able to sort of drift out of the quote unquote liberal box. Well, not even the liberal box, but just the determined and the stated position that they will be opposed to conservatives who would also be social conservatives, who would be opposed to abandoning Jim Crow or opening up economic opportunities and so forth. Those who had achieved those two things, who had seen the death of legalized Jim Crow, and who have made great economic gains, they began to realign themselves and to look more and began to look at the world in a more conservative manner. And this begins the rise of the African American conservative community. And to be certain, to reiterate it again, there had always been conservatives and liberals within the African American community. A joke, a sort of not so tongue in cheek, but I would say a keen comment, a keen statement on the community would be that you had it's sort of a play on the old Revolutionary War statement made by John Adams, where you had 1/3 in favor of the revolution, 1/3 opposed to it, and 1/3 who didn't care. You could say the exact same thing with the African American community, to where you would have 1/3 who were always pushing relentlessly for increased civil rights, always agitating the situation, always pushing the situation to get a better outcome. And then you had the conservative wing, who would sort of be weary to inflame passions either way, who would always be on guard for the backlash of pushing the envelope of trying to get greater equality. And that is to say that they would not want greater equality, but it goes to say that they were not really willing to risk the ire of or the focused attention of segregationists. And then, of course, you had a portion of the community, a third of the community, who simply took no interest in it, who did not, either because they did not have the luxury because of economic means, or they didn't want to be socially ostracized, or for any other reason, simply did not get involved in it. A keen remark made by many who were pushing for civil rights was that most often they were greeted by people who said, don't involve them with that nonsense, keep that nonsense away from them. And that group would sort of fall into that category, the keep that nonsense away from me category. All right, and just to say once again before we begin this, throughout the history of the Republic, the African American community has lobbied and championed liberal causes. Liberal causes defined as abolition, the abolition of slavery, the abolition of the internal and foreign slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade, and the internal, the domestic slave trade. Um, um, Civil rights and civil rights. That is voting rights, citizenship rights, and equality before the law. Those have been things that the African American community had consistently since 1619 advocated for, have fought for. But since the 1980s, a marginal and new voice within the African American community has emerged, and this voice is of the African American conservatives, a group which, in high contrast to the majority of the African American community, opposes affirmative action and opposes all social welfare programs. Particularly the programs that were created to specifically benefit minority, aka African American communities. These new conservatives are especially vocal in their criticisms of affirmative action. Let me just say that. They argue that the programs run contrary to American principles of equality, that it stigmatizes African Americans, who will be deemed as less intelligent, less hardworking, less capable, less worthy in the eyes of their contemporaries and their social colleagues. Social welfare programs. They also criticize them, and they use the old argument stemming from the 1930s that labels social welfare programs as a social narcotic that encourages dependency. Now, the conservative African American community is not without its own criticisms, as many of their opponents raise and point out that their arguments are full of contradictions, that the main proponents of conservatism are hypocrites. The main hypocrisy revolves around the argument that many notable African American conservatives themselves were beneficiaries of affirmative action programs, and that now that they are successful, they want an end to such programs. Others charge that African American conservative community is largely that they are largely the result and are largely manipulated by the conservative former segregationists and conservative media groups looking to dispel charges of racism or prejudice that they promote African Americans and encourage them to argue on such issues or against such issues, I should say, has affirmative action. In any regard, the African American conservative community and African American conservatives individually have attained a level of recognition that it's really hard to ignore, even if their views do not appeal to the community or to many in the Republic at large. Now, a number of African Americans conservatives have risen to prominence and have become national household names. Figures such as J.C. Watts, former congressman from Oklahoma, Ken Hamlin, and of course Stanley Crouch. Now the most arguably, I should say, because J.C. Watts is a pretty big draw himself, but arguably the most prominent African American conservatives are most arguably current Associate Justice Clarence Thomas and Ward Connerly. Now, Clarence Thomas is the second African American to sit on the United States Supreme Court, and Connerly is a major California businessman who played an important and controversial role in ending affirmative action in California. Now, Clarence Thomas was born in rural Georgia, and he was raised by his grandparents. He graduated from Holy Cross College and attended Yale University's law school. Thomas developed an anti-integrationist and anti-affirmative action outlook and view on society during his minority. He saw his grandfather's businesses suffer as the result of loss of customers. As integration was going on, African Americans were no longer sort of pigeonholed or restricted to conducting commerce only with African American businesses. They can go out and enjoy the business and social life with the community at large. and many did so. Many African American small businesses failed as integration roles. They were unable to compete with the lower prices and the larger selection of merchandise that many of their more well-established European American counterparts could do. They could not field and entertain their customer base. They could not field such a wide selection, and as such, they could not entertain their customer bases, and they lost out. And Thomas's grandfather was one such businessman. His family business was one such business that failed to be able to compete with major European American stores. Thomas recalls feelings of resentment being directed towards him during his collegiate career, and he attributed these feelings of resentment not due to him being an African American in a previously in an area or at a school that previously prohibited the enrollment of African Americans or sought to reject African American applicants, but he attributed all this to affirmative action and affirmative action programs. Thomas's positions brought him to the attention of the Reagan administration. He was appointed the head of the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission, the EEOC, and during the Bush presidency, Clarence Thomas was appointed successively to the United States Circuit Board of Appeals in 1989, and in 1991, of course, he was appointed to the United States Supreme Court. Now, Clarence Thomas's appointment to the United States Supreme Court caused major controversy. Most notably, it was a controversial move because many prominent segregationists opposed it. Many of the neo-segregationists opposed it, and of course, a great controversy was raised by the public claims made by Anita Hill, a former staff member of his during his tenure at the EEOC. And Hill accused Thomas of multiple instances of sexual harassment. Now, the Senate heard testimony from both Thomas and Hill regarding the matter, which tarnished Thomas's name and led him to declare that the entire affair was nothing more than a high-tech lynching by his opponents. In the end, Thomas was confirmed, and his seat on the United States Supreme Court, he was confirmed and he was appointed there, and he has remained there, seated on the Supreme Court ever since. I believe that he has of right now the most tenured, the most senior and tenured associate justice on the court. I think everybody else think Antonin Scalia was the last person to be seated on the court who had seniority over him. Now, from Thomas, we move on to Ward Connolly. Now, Ward Connolly was born in rural Louisiana, and he earned his Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from Sacramento State College. Now, Connolly began a professional career as a civil servant and later as a government consultant. Now, that position saw Connolly be awarded contracts in excess of $140,000 in affirmative action government contracting. And government contracting that was implicitly under direction of then federal and state affirmative action programs. During this time, Connolly became a Republican. He became a major Republican fundraiser, and he contributed to Pete Wilson's gubernatorial campaign. Now, in 1993, Wilson appointed Connolly to the University of California Board of Regents. As a Board of Regents member, Connolly aggressively pushed for an end to the state's affirmative action programs. Flush with its success, Connolly championed Prop 209. After he was successful in getting the university to drop or dismantle its affirmative action programs, Connolly moved on to dismantling statewide affirmative action programs. He was an aggressive proponent of Prop 209. Which ended affirmative action, have we noted earlier, in the state of California. Now, after his successes in California, at both the state level and as a member of the Board of Regents, after his successes, Connolly founded the American Civil Rights Initiative, an organization that would champion the rolling back of affirmative action and other civil rights laws nationally across the republic. In an ironic twist, the American Civil Rights Initiative was an anti-civil rights organization, or is an anti-civil rights organization. Now, Connolly's first attempt in Florida was rejected. It was rejected by both Democratic politicians and Republican politicians, and it failed to catch on anywhere else. Thereafter, Connolly sort of took the hint and bowed out of the national debate regarding affirmative action. Did not end his career, he simply bowed out of it. And with that, we'll end here. That will conclude our look at the African American community after 1970. As always, hit like, subscribe, and comment, and let me know what you guys thought about this lecture. And I will see you guys next time for another lecture.